Thank you. My name is Thomas Kühne. I am the Strasser Chair in Holocaust History and the Director of the Strasser Center. And today it's really a great pleasure for me to formally introduce this event tonight. Welcome everyone to this conference, which is organized by Tana Aksham. It is my pleasure to introduce to you, although that's really not necessary, to you Tana Aksham, the Kalustian and Muga Professor of Armenian Genocide Studies. As you have heard, Tana recently celebrated his birthday, and I was surprised to hear that it actually was his 65th. I always thought it's the 30th. Okay. I have to say, I find even more important that you are celebrating a decade of working with us here at the Strasser Center. I remember pretty well 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, when we had a search committee, which I had to chair, and I mean, Tana made it easy, the decision, I should say. I mean, we had really a good pool, but in the end, it was pretty easy. So, I mean, I think we did the right thing in hiring Tana. Tana, these have been 10 amazing years, not only because a wonderful friendship that developed during that time, but also because of your invaluable contributions to the Strasser Center's Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. The Strasser Center was established as a center for Holocaust studies, but now, and thanks to Tana, it has gained a worldwide reputation as the leading doctoral training institution on genocide studies at large. This would not have been possible without Tana's thinking, of course, about the Armenian genocide, but also about how to advance the concept of genocide, about genocides around the world, about human rights violations, and about how to prevent them. Of course, the Armenian genocide is the focus of his work. You all know that, and so is this conference, which promises to challenge our ideas about genocidal continuity, a major goal of the Strasser Center. Tana, thank you for organizing this conference. I want to use this opportunity to also thank the friends of Tana's chair for their support of this conference and of Tana's research activities. Last but not least, it's a pleasure for me to thank for the co-sponsorship of this conference, Marc, Mamigonian, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, and the Knights of Vardar. I hope you enjoy or learn something from this conference, from the evening tonight and the conference tomorrow. I pass on to Tana, who will explain what the conference is about. Thank you, and let us thank Tana again for 10 years.
Thank you. I'll make it very short. Why this conference? Why we organize this conference on Abdul Hamid? This year marks 100th anniversary of the death of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, one of the most polarizing figures in Ottoman history, and it was originally the idea of Emre, one of my graduate students, came and pushed me to organize this event. Thank you, Emre. Sultan Abdul Hamid is a very controversial figure in Ottoman Turkish history. Christians in the Ottoman Empire dubbed him as the Red, Bloody Sultan. The Western media represented him as a murderous despot. Meanwhile, for Muslim Turks, Kurds, and Arabs, he exemplified an historic great Khan, the leaders of the leaders. To reflect on his legacy in this milestone year, I have gathered an international group of scholars to examine the violent policies carried out his name. This conference will examine key aspects of the Abdul Hamid period, 1876 until 1909, and its aftermath by taking a closer look at actions carried out against Christians, especially the Armenians. Specialists will examine the significant and large-scale massacres committed against minorities during this period, the impact of the reforms initiated by Abdul Hamid II or imposed by the great powers, and the policies towards these same groups. Finally, they will consider the continuities and discontinuities with the catastrophic final years of the Ottoman Empire that saw the almost total annihilation of the Armenians and other Christians through genocide and other forms of mass violence. This is all about this conference, and I invite now Marc Mamigonian to introduce our speakers. Thank you very much again.
Honor. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to introduce and moderate the first session of our conference, the Abdul Hamid II Era and Beyond, Massacres and Reform, Rupture and Continuity. And before anything else, I must join in the chorus of thank yous to the sponsors of this conference for their financial support, the Friends of the Robert Aram and Marian Kalustian and Stephan and Marian Mugar Chair in Armenian Genocide Studies at Clark University, my employer, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies. To Taner and to Emre Can Daliolu for their work in assembling the scholars from whom we will hear tonight and tomorrow, to Mary Jane Ryan, Executive Director of the Strassler Center, Robin Conroy, Program Manager at the Strassler Center, and Alyssa Duke, Administrative Assistant at the Strassler Center, for their tremendous efforts in making our plans or our thoughts into a real conference. So thank you. For many years now, Taner and I have had a series of conversations complaining about lots of things, but high on the list has been the scarcity of new research on the Hamidian massacres. Happily, this situation has changed very much for the better in the past decade or so, in large part thanks to the efforts of many of the scholars here participating in this conference, as well as others who are not here with us. 10 years ago, it would have been very challenging, or rather I would say it would have been impossible to assemble so many scholars engaged in this kind of research. Until quite recently, most of the cutting-edge writing on these events of the 1890s, such as it was, had been done in the 1890s. George Sherinian, in his bibliography of the Armenian massacres of 1894 to 97, which was published in a 2001 special issue of the Armenian Review on the 1894 Sassoon massacre, which was edited by Ronald Suny, and which was at the time a rare example of new scholarship on the subject. Sherinian aptly remarked that modern scholarship has tended to overlook this series of massacres and concentrate on the 1915 Armenian genocide. However, this tendency in the scholarship did not prevent many definitive sounding declarations to the effect that the Hamidian massacres, terrible as they were, must be understood as entirely separate from the genocide of some 20 years later, or on the flip side of this, that the Hamidian massacres must in fact be seen as part of the genocidal process that stretches from the 1890s into the 1920s. Today, the state of our knowledge is far beyond where it was, yet still this fundamental debate continues, and we will hear tonight the views of two distinguished scholars, Ronald Suny and Stephan Astourian. I will introduce both of them now and then give them the floor until it is time for discussion, and I will endeavor to hold each of them to around 30 minutes each, hopefully not through violence. Ronald Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan and Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He is the author of the books The Baku Commune, The Making of the Georgian Nation, Looking Toward Ararat, The Revenge of the Past, The Soviet Experiment, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, Red Flag Unfurled, History, Historians, and the Russian Revolution, and co-author of Russia's Empires. And he will speak tonight, give a talk tonight entitled Exemplary Repression or Genocide, the Hamidian Massacres. Stephan Astourian is the William Saroyan Director of the Armenian Studies Program at the University of California, Berkeley, and an Associate Adjunct Professor in Armenian and Caucasian History. Astourian has published extensively on modern Armenian, Ottoman, and Azerbaijani history and on post-Soviet Caucasian politics. His essay, Armenia's Foreign Policy, Some Perspectives, appeared in occasional papers of the Armenian Studies program at UC Berkeley, and he has published reflections on Ottoman historiography about the role of non-Muslims and Armenian Ottomans in trade and the urban economy in Le Genocide Armenian, Cent de Recherche. I'm sorry about my French. That's the best I can do. And The Silence of the Land, Agrarian Relations, Power and Ethnicity in Late Ottoman Turkey in A Question of Genocide. A book on the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict and a co-edited volume with Raymond Kevorkian on state and collective violence in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey are forthcoming. And Professor Astourian will present From the Hamidian Era to the Young Turks, reflections on issues of continuity and discontinuity. So please welcome our first speaker tonight.
I think it's appropriate to begin with my own reminiscences about Taner Akcan. I knew him when he had just left his former job. He was now a retired former unemployed revolutionary. And he decided to do something truly revolutionary, be the first Turk scholar who would talk about the Armenian genocide. You heard already tonight about how much this meant to the field in general. I remember that a certain person, a professor, I'm not sure he was a scholar, said at one point at an Armenian meeting, if we don't train more Armenian scholars to do the genocide, these chairs will go to Turks and Jews. This was an outrageous thing to say. But, in fact, because these chairs are now going to people not Armenian, this actually shows the maturity of the field. That it isn't just Armenians navel-gazing and suffering over their past tragedies, but also it has become a field in international scholarship. And I want to thank Taner, who has made this great leap forward and extending the field from a rather parochial concern of Armenians alone to now a field that's respected far beyond our own small nation. Okay? That word genocide, that fraught and overcharged word, has been deployed, as I just saw in a Toronto conference last week, as a polemical tool by journalists and even scholars to condemn incidents of mass killing under this rubric that has acquired a particular and powerful resonance. While some would limit the term genocide to the Holocaust, that is the Judeocide of World War II, others, more recently, have extended the meaning of genocide to any incident of mass killing. Now that first practice, just the Holocaust fits in, narrows the term, obviously, too drastically. There's no sense of comparison there at all. The latter, the extension, the dilution of the term, unnecessarily clouds explanation of why genocide. Analysts, in my view, ought to refrain from that first collapsing of all forms of mass violence into a single case, or the second into a single type, usually called genocide. As defined by the United Nations Genocide Convention, genocide is about the killing of a people, not the killing of people. That is, it is the intentional mass murder directed against a cultural, national, ethnic, or religious group, or in the exact words of the convention, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Genocide, in other words, in legal terms and international law, is a subset of the larger category of crimes against humanity. And that larger category certainly would include the Ukrainian Holodomor, the death famine, the Kazakh famine, and other state-directed attacks on social and political groups. Now we know that when the convention itself was being designed, every state involved in it tried to get their own understanding of genocide in that convention, right? And everyone blames, of course, the Soviet Union for limiting it to ethnic and racial cases, and leaving out political groups. Stalin himself, with his red pencil, crossed out political groups because it would have meant the Great Purges. Of course, whatever you say about the Soviet Union or Russia is always right, as long as it's about Russia. That's what the great Will Rogers said. But they forget that the United States and Britain also didn't want political crimes in this convention. The British didn't want anything that they had been doing in colonies in the convention, and the Americans were afraid that lynching, Jim Crow, our racial policies would also have them being complicit or guilty of genocide. So I think that maybe those powers did us a great favor. By limiting the term, they talked about a specific kind of violence, mass killing, this ethno-religious, racial, whatever. And therefore, we can talk about what are the intentions here, what are the causes of this, what is the extent of it, and how is it different from other kinds of things like the Irish famine or the Bengal famine or whatever. So, what I've tried to do in this paper, and I can't give it all to you, it's 20 pages, and I don't have the time, is talk about different forms of violence. Now, we all know from the study of the Ottoman Empire, and later even in the Turkish Republic, right up to the present, that violence and even mass killing has long been part of the governing practices of successive governments. Understandably then, social scientists, most particularly historians and anthropologists, have concentrated their investigations on this seeming ubiquity and normality of state violence, which are punctuated by extraordinary outbursts of killing on a massive scale. The violence against the Kurds today, which in the minds of many in the academy and in the towns of eastern Anatolia, where I was this summer, is often linked to genocide. As the Kurds themselves put it, the Turks had you for breakfast, they will have us for lunch. But it seems to me, in our examination of the Hamidian massacres, it might be more precisely seen that these Kurdish killings, in fact, are closer to the systematic repression and occasional use of military force during the Hamidian massacres than to the Armenian genocide. And I would note that the people in this room, and in a recent issue of a French journal, have in fact shown very clearly how these massacres, in fact, are different from genocide. While to many victims, and certainly to moral observers, the effects of violence are similar no matter what the intentions or motivations of the perpetrators. But for social scientists and historians, distinctions among the cases, it seems to me, are clear and important if we want to understand why they happen. For analytical purposes then, I'm going to distinguish three different forms of violence. You probably can think of others. I talk first about exemplary violence. That is violence deployed to terrorize people into submission and obedience. For example, the occupation by Israel of Palestine, I would use as an example of exemplary violence to maintain the occupation. That should be distinguished from excisionary or exterminationist violence, the kind you see in a genocide. Excisionary violence aims to eliminate special kinds of people, in the case of genocide, a designated ethno-national, religious, or racial group, a people. And these are different types of violence from what you might call residual violence, or what in America is fashionably used as a euphemism, collateral damage, which is violence caused by policies or actions intended for other purposes than the actual killing of the people. And that occurs often in state-induced famines like the Holodomor. The Hamidian massacres of Armenians and Assyrians in the mid-1890s would be, in my view, an example primarily of exemplary violence, while the Armenian genocide was an extraordinary and singular example of a new regime of violence when exemplary violence gave way to excisionary violence, the state effort to eliminate whole peoples, in this case Armenians and Assyrians, from the imperial territory, or at least to disperse them, Islamize them, marginalize them, and live in the desert, but nowhere else, in order to destroy them as a coherent and conscious people able to maintain a social, political, or even cultural existence. In other words, to reproduce themselves as a people. For the Hamidian regime, indeed for much of Ottoman history before and after the 1890s, the use of state violence and the deployment of military force, whether regular or irregular, was part of the governing regime. It was normal in day-to-day governance. Occasionally, this normal, everyday violence, used to keep order or obtain revenues or fight crime or rebellion, would metastasize into much more systematic massacre and deportations. Given the persistent Ottoman policy of using violence as a form of government, it's understandable that historians have often adopted what's called a continuity theory rather than a rupture theory, emphasizing the connections of these 1890 massacres to the genocide of 1915. Think about the things that are similar. The perpetrators were state actors and their agents. The victims were Christian Armenians and Assyrians. The state disguised its involvement and denied its responsibilities. There were habits and practices of mass killing which over time became routine and were thought to be justified. Similar arguments about state security, about those treacherous, rebellious people, were used. And both the Hamidian and Young Turk governments sought to nationalize, I put that in quotes, that is, Islamicize or even Turkify Anatolia as a secure base for the ruling people of the empire as they lost imperial territories in the Balkans. If you look at some of the recent research that's been done, and I'll mention a few people here, some of whom are here, you can see how varied, how diverse these earlier massacres were. In his work on Sassoon, Owen Miller summarizes the parallel processes in the two tragedies. The underlying patterns, he writes, of Ottoman centralization, the divide and rule tactics, the extraction of resources, corruption, impoverishment of communities, imprisonment of those who challenged the status quo, and terroristic violence left hundreds dead in the mountains of Sassoon in 1894. The same processes helped to explain the subsequent violence in the 1890s and the Armenian genocide 20 years later. So those continuities, those similarities, those links are there. And yet, despite its long pedigree, and by the way, this continuity theory goes back way before the genocide itself to the reign of Abdul Hamid II, the differences, it seems to me, are key. In the Hamidian massacres, there were certainly not only exemplary, but also excisionary aspects to the massacres, which included removal and murder of village populations, but these excisions were not carried out systematically as they would be in the genocide. Abdul Hamid encouraged and permitted officers and ordinary people to rise against the Armenians, and he was happy to see Armenian presence in Anatolia reduced. But I would argue that this Sultan, his modernizing program, contained within it a conservative, restorationist agenda that sought order above all. His personal paranoia reflected his own and more broadly social anxieties about unregulated change, the loss of status of Muslims domestically and the empire itself internationally, and the special position within and outside Ottoman lands of a people, the Armenians, whose talents he and others recognized and resented, only made them a convenient target. Armenians had to be controlled. They had to be taught a lesson, reduced in influence and numbers, but not erased from the multicultural mosaic which made up the empire. I would argue that Abdul Hamid was an empire preserver and not an ethno-national nation maker like Kemal Atatürk in another generation. What emerges from the local studies that are being published, the dissertations, special editions, etc., is a picture of a variety of acts of violence carried out in different locations with a diversity of causes of the violence. Miller, for instance, shows that in the initial massacres in Suny in 1894, this is the one that began the cycle of devastation and mass death, armed attacks by the regular army ordered by the Sultan precipitated the killings and the destruction of communities. In Kharput, as Ali Sipayev and Deborah Meyerson demonstrate, the violence came from outside the city, from attacks by armed Kurds from ungoverned Dersim. Local authorities attempted for a time to protect the city, but ultimately failed, and then were seen to permit acts of violence. In Sivas, the massacres were a case of an urban riot, a pogrom, initiated by Muslims fearful that Armenians were gaining advantages and power from European-imposed reforms. In studies of Diyarbakir, Yeleverdi, who's here, showed that the anti-Armenian violence, as far as can be ascertained, emanated primarily from a local level, actively supported by local Ottoman authorities, with the central state mainly occupying a mitigating role. The picture emerging is one of distinct and separate points of violence initiated or breaking out in different places at different times. Coordination from the center appears to be absent, but what links the various massacres is first the generalized fear of change that the anticipated reforms would bring, change that would disadvantage Muslims and give privileges, perhaps even autonomy, to Armenians. And a second common thread tying these cases together is the permissiveness, even encouragement and participation in many cases of state authorities and military in the violence against Armenians and Assyrians. The bloody Sultan might be a phantom figure. His orders might be vague and contradictory, but he created a permissive atmosphere in which killing was possible, in which violence against the other was generated from above and understood below. And I'm talking here about Abdul Hamid II, not Donald Trump. In the classic analysis of how historians from William H. Langer on, there's been a dubious theory proposed called the provocation thesis, which Robert Nelson made quite famous. And in what this new literature shows is that there has been a determined attempt in the time of Abdul Hamid II, which then continued into the period of the genocide, in which, and one scholar calls this linguistic camouflage, that you can find in the Ottoman Turkish text, which would describe these events as disturbances, turmoil, chaos, turbulence, as if to emphasize that they were spontaneous, bottom-up, emotional responses to provocation by those pesky Armenians, thus shifting the blame for violence to the actual victims. And on the other hand, in the same documents, you can find consciousness, rationality, and planning being downgraded, and the naturalness of a revenge response highlighted. You find in these documents the passive voice extensively used. In other words, a fire breaks out. It's not set by anyone. At the same time, an active voice is used to describe the actions of the Armenians, who are said to commit seditious acts and to cause all of this turmoil. The documents also shift the blame, of course, from the Turks to those ignorant and savage Kurds, those troublemakers, those deviants. Well, the recent literature shows that the provocation theory is basically a fabrication, a justification after the fact. Let me say a word. Oh, my timer never started. How are you doing?
You're doing fine.
Okay, so let me say a word then about the genocide itself, 1915. Here, the massive expulsions of that year, the very scale of which, as well as the intended effects to rid Eastern Anatolia of a whole people, made this event, the genocide, far more radical, far more revolutionary. It was a fundamental transformation of the imperial setup. I argue in my book, They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else, it's only about $30 on Amazon, if you like, that the genocide was not planned long in advance or continuous with these earlier policies of conservative restoration through massacre. That earlier regimes used to keep order and change to some extent the demographic composition of towns in borderlands, this was something far more fundamental. Rather than spontaneously generated from religion or even ethnicity, I eliminate in the book ideas that this is somehow a Muslim Christian thing or that it was all about nationalism or ethno-nationalism, though all of that plays a certain role, certainly as the marker of who the other is, that is important. I tried to show that it was the mentality that had been generated over generations that found its way both in the leaders of the post-1908 government, the Young Turks, at least their radical wing, and then into the population more generally once the public sphere was opened up in those post-1908 years. I argue in the book, and I won't go into it in great detail, we can talk about it if you like, that there developed over time what I call an affective disposition, an emotional, cognitive, toxic mix which constructed the Armenians as an existential threat to the government, to the regime, to the empire, to Turks and Muslims themselves. And that generated over time, it became more acute after 1908, particularly after the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Think about those Balkan Wars. The Balkans had been the very center of the Ottoman Empire. The leaders of the Young Turks were from the Balkans, from Salonika, from Macedonia, from those parts. And they suffered terribly from those losses, which then made Turkish nationalists, insofar as they were there, look eastward toward Anatolia, which now became Vatan, which became the fatherland. The last possible refuge for the rulers of this empire. And there were those Armenians in the way. And the Armenians they constructed as people who were not fundamentally Ottoman, though these people had lived in the empire for centuries. And by the way, here's something that I think is not emphasized enough in the literature. The great bulk of the Armenians were not ever in open rebellion, as many Kurds had been, against this empire. There was no serious Armenian insurrection, as there was in Macedonia or in Albania or other places. The Armenian revolutionaries were groups that tried hard to mobilize certain Armenians, maybe for self-defense in their own view. It was very difficult to do that. Read their memoirs. You find how difficult it is to create collective action. This is not strange to social scientists or political scientists, right? Most Ottoman Armenians were Ottomans and would have been loyal to that empire. And thousands of them served in the Ottoman army and died at Sarıkamış before they were demobilized, turned into Amele Tabulada, work battalions, and murdered, right? Removing the muscle of the Armenian nation. So that whole construction is wrong. And then there's this whole thing about Russia, you know? Some Armenians, you know, we know some of them defected to Russia. Some Armenians certainly would have preferred Russia, and there are instances of that. But then it's generalized to the entire population at a time when Russia was also very suspect, right? This was a group that was not very dependable, that was arresting on the eve of World War I, Armenian revolutionaries, and trying hundreds of Dashnags in a giant trial. So this is a much more ambivalent and ambiguous situation than is usually a given thing, purchase. The genocidal determination, as we see in both the Judaicide and in the Armenian massacre, the genocidal elimination need not be total. What it has to do, and what it did do, was render the people impotent. politically, and possibly culturally. Few modern mass killings, or even genocides, have resulted in the total liquidation of a people, and both Armenian and Jewish genocides resulted in new states being formed and populated with survivors and their descendants. But the mass of Armenians never returned to the historic homeland in Anatolia that they had inhabited for 3,000 years. And the Jews, while hardly totally erased, never reconstituted the vital Yiddish culture that they had evolved over many centuries in Central and Eastern Europe. Genocides have results. They work. And they often are the founding crime of other nations. Turkey among them, the United States, and others. If it's not genocide, then ethnic cleansing. Getting rid of the people without killing them because you want the land and not the people, as in Palestine. The purpose of this genocide was to remove a perceived threat of the Armenians. Armenians that they believed had a fantasy that they wanted an independent state. What I calculated in my research was that Armenians wanted to live as Ottomans with a certain degree of autonomy and protection of their property and their lives. And that was why they went to Europe repeatedly to try to get that protection. I also believe that the genocide was not a bottom-up spontaneous revolt or of ordinary people, but came from a few people at the top who made decisions, who then permitted the kinds of violence and encouraged it. And if you resisted the genocide, you could be punished, removed, or even killed. I also argue in the book and in this paper that had there been no world war, there would have been no genocide. Not only because there would not have been a fog of war to cover up the events, but because the radical sense of endangerment among the Young Turks would not have been acute. And they did try to negotiate with the Armenians. Without the war, there would have been less motivation for the revolutionary solution, and more political opportunities would have existed for negotiation and compromise. So, the choice of genocide was not preordained. It was not inevitable. Though, as a good historian, we try to gather all the causes we can get. Right? We're not political scientists. We don't look for parsimony. We look for just over-determining what this event could be, the international, the land competition, all of these different things, the resentment toward the Armenian bourgeoisie, lots of causes there, lots of background. But difference, and there was differences, do not lead necessarily to conflict. Conflict does not necessarily lead to violence, and violence certainly does not necessarily lead to genocide. What to denialists and their sympathizers appears to be a rational and justified strategic choice to eliminate a rebellious and seditious population, in my reading, is seen as the outcome of the Young Turks leaders' pathological construction of the Armenian enemy, their delusional rationality. The actions that the Young Turks decided upon were based in this affective disposition that led to distorted interpretations of social reality and exaggerated estimations of threats. The conviction that Armenians desired to form an independent state was a fantasy of the Young Turks and of a few Armenian extremists. The great majority of Armenians had been willing to live within the Ottoman Empire if their lives and property could be secured. And they clung to that belief that a future was possible, including the Dashnak party, within the empire, long after some, like the priest Grigoris Balakian, thought was reasonable. Still, they'd been socialized as Ottomans. This was their home. This is what they knew. Only when their own government once again turned them into pariahs did some of them defect and resist. The successive Ottoman government's intentions to modernize its empire, and it wanted to preserve an empire, not make a nation state, in fact, encouraged backwardness. Governments like Stalin's or Abdul Hamid's or Talat's can make a people stupid. They ruined churches. They burnt out homes. The madrasas decayed, and all of them testified to a policy that made the country poorer, less educated, and less productive. Such policies, first in the 1890s, and then repeated on a grander scale in 1915-1916, continued through the Republican period in the repressions of the Armenians, the Greeks, and Kurds. And even today, in the Turkey of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a program of authoritarian homogenization aimed primarily now at millions of Kurds who cannot even study in their own language, drives a country of great potential backwards into a dark future. Thank you.
I will have a technical problem here. I like to lecture standing. It makes me feel tall. That's very important to me. Thank you, Dana. Thanks so much. Well, first I would like to thank Professor Taner for his kind invitation. I have learned much over the years from his scholarship, and it's good to be here. I am also honored and happy to participate in this session with my very distinguished colleague, Professor Ronald Suny, whom I have known for many, many years. I would like to start with some conceptual matters, and as I say in the classroom, big one, conceptual matters. Little one, continuity, discontinuity in history, I view that issue as being essentially a fallacy, intellectually. Let's take a state of affairs, call it M, or call it Stephan Astourian. Let's look at it along a linear chronological line made up of points A, B, C, D, and so on. M, as we would say in the Bay Area, is evolving, but is still M. And then suddenly, in point in time K, M turns into a state of affairs X, totally unrelated to M. That is practically not feasible intellectually. Let's then look at the concept of genocide. Genocide can be researched as an event made up, of course, of sub-events and multiple decisions. However, genocides can also be understood only if they are analyzed as the result of a process. Decades ago, Israel Charny created a model, for the various stages. Gregory Stanton and others have done so. I tend to look at genocides also as a process. As a conclusion, on the basis of the 2 points I have just mentioned, if we compare the Armenian genocide with the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide was overdetermined. I will return to that word in a few minutes. According to my colleague, Professor Margaret Anderson, a specialist of Germany, there was almost no anti-Jewish collective violence of any kind in Germany during the decades preceding the arrival to power of the Nazis. If we compare that with the Armenian case, the Sassoon massacres, the Anatolia-wide massacres of 95-96, the Adana and Cilician massacres of 1909, and dozens of sporadic, more limited cases of violence in this or that village during this time period, and from 1909 to 1915, we can say that the Armenian genocide was preceded by a long history of violence. Finally, I mentioned the word overdetermined. By overdetermined, I do not mean that it was destined to happen, the Armenian genocide. I fully agree with Professor Suny that had the First World War not occurred, had the Reform Act not been agreed upon, had Sarıkamış not happened, and maybe had British and other ships not appeared in the Eastern Mediterranean and Aegean, and the Dardanelles not occurred, there might not have been a genocide. I don't know. But that is, I suspect, likely. Big two, I would like to frame the question. What are the causes and what time frame are we looking at? In my mind, the Armenian genocide is directly linked with what was called the Armenian question. There is no genocide without the Armenian question. Now, for a very long time, people dealt with the Armenian question or called the Armenian question the diplomatic consequence of the real question. The real question was an agrarian crisis in the eastern provinces, resulting from the destruction of the emirate of Bedr Khan, a Kurdish leader, and the subsequent rise to power of sheikhs, quite intolerant, anarchy, intolerance, and so on. The real Eastern question stemmed from the failed Ottoman attempt at centralization in those areas, and in particular the phenomenon of double taxation. The real Armenian question was made even worse with the land law of the late 1950s, which made acquiring land even more valuable than earlier, and thus led to even more land usurpation from the Armenians. And finally, the real Armenian question was worsened even further, I would say, if I can do that, after the Crimean War, with the arrival of the first wave of muhajirs or refugees. About 0.5 million Circassians out of 1 million were settled in Anatolia, most of them in Armenian inhabited areas. These led to massive land usurpation, pervasive low-level violence against Armenians, and all of these remained unpunished. It is only in the late 60s that the Armenian Patriarchate, with the arrival of Khimian Hayrik from the eastern provinces, realized there was a problem and documented those problems in two major reports submitted to the Sublime Porte. Those reports included the location of the violences, the type of violence, and very often even could pinpoint the name of the culprits. For reasons that remain to be researched, the Ottoman state did nothing to remedy this situation. I am not saying it favored it. We don't know what happened during this period. But we do know that when Sultan Abdul Hamid came to power, then he had no interest whatsoever in remedying this situation. So after 76, 77, then there is no doubt about what is happening. I would like to remind you that there was no Armenian political party to speak of before 1885. That's about 35 years after the beginning of the land problem in the eastern provinces. So the real Armenian question, the foundation of it, had nothing to do with the diplomatic side. The diplomatic side, referred to by my professor, Richard Hovannessian, was the consequence. The land question was the infrastructure, the other one was the superstructure. In a nutshell, the real Armenian question had nothing to do with autonomy, independence, or anything like that. It could have been solved, it wasn't. Little to, what did that Armenian question lead to? Of course, Europeans, starting with Russia at the Treaty of San Stefano, and immediately afterwards a number of European states at Berlin, seized upon the Armenian crisis for their own purposes, of course. Not that they were in love with Armenians. I would like to remind you, in case you forgot it, that there is a Palestinian peace process going on. I believe it has been going on now for, I don't know, 30 years, 35 years. It keeps going on, and I am pretty optimistic that things will improve further. So the Armenian question was about, like a little bit, the Palestinian peace process. You see, it went on for a while. People were working on it assiduously, day in, day out. They were concerned about it. What was this issue? The issue was, again, the sporadic violence in the eastern provinces, the land question, and so on. Did all of that end with Sultan Abdul Hamid? Not at all. The negotiations between the leading Armenian political party, the ARF, and the Committee of Union and Progress between approximately 1910 and 1912, the main issue there was the land question, and we have amongst us Dr. Dikran Khalidian, who wrote a book about those contacts. What about the Reform Act of 1940? The land question was so important that it was, I believe, the only issue that was directly put under the supervision of the two inspector generals. That is, they were directly in charge of it, not their underlings. You know? So the Armenian question is going on, and here there is continuity. We can thus see the continuity between, in this case, between the Hamidian period and the CUP period, and the issue is again the Armenian question, and underneath the Armenian question there is the land question, violence, lack of punishment. Big three, pervasiveness of violence. I would like to start with some general statements. I view the failure of the Tanzimat and its concept of Osmanlılık, that is, equality of all inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire, as being crucial, and I will tell you why. I also view the Hamidian massacres as crucial in understanding what came after them. Of course, these two statements are clearly related to one another, since Sultan Abdul Hamid emphasized the superiority of Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. Finally, I view the period stretching from 1894 to 1922 as being foundational for the subsequent violence. Little to deconstructing violence and continuity. When I was young, I had some hair, I was in elite classes, I had to read a guy whose turgid prose is still in my mind. His name was Derrida. Yeah, he talked about deconstruction and how if you see the word house, you can deconstruct it within the text, in the context of the text, and then in the semantic context, a house, a hut, a cabin, a residence, a palace, and so on. How does house sit in the middle of this lengthy thing? And then you can look at it diachronically. Now let's take a look at collective and state violence in the late Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, diachronically, mostly, and also to a certain extent in the similarities they share. The result is quite breathtaking. The diversity of the targeted groups constitutes the first characteristic of Ottoman Turkish violence. Let us list them alphabetically almost. Alevi Kurds, Alevi Turks, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, leftists, Sunni Kurds, Yazidis. Four axes of violence structure the victimization of these groups. What I mean by axes is a device to provide a kind of explanation. The first axis is religious and stems from the Muslim-non-Muslim divides. It characterizes Turkish violence against the Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. Kurdish violence against the Armenians. Turkish and Kurdish violence against the Yazidi. Of course, that violence had other characteristics also. It wasn't merely religious, but the religious element was part of it. Second axis is also religious, but it is essentially denominational. Sunni Muslim versus non-Sunni Muslim. It characterizes Turkish violence against the Alevi, whether Turks or Kurds. Unlike the case of the first axis, ethnicity here does not play a role, since Alevi Turks are also subjected to violence, be it what a colleague called epistemic violence or physical. The third axis is mainly ethnic, and it characterizes Turkish violence against the Kurd, be they Sunni or Alevi. Final axis is purely political, right wing against left, but even these are not purely political. Leftist Alevi Kurds played a very prominent role, so some Kurds, so you cannot reduce it to just left versus the state and extreme right. The second characteristic of Ottoman and Turkish violence is its remarkable continuity since the 1890s. Let me just list a few of them for the fun of it, to cheer you up. Sassoon Massacre, 1894. Armenian massacres throughout Ottoman Empire, 95-96. Cilician massacres, 1909. Ethnic cleansing of Greeks living in eastern Thrace and Aegean region, 1314. Ethnic cleansing of the Black Sea Greeks, subsequently. Armenian genocide, no need for dates. Massacres of Greeks from Anatolia, 1920-22. Ethnic cleansing of the survivors of the Armenian genocide from the 1920s to even mid-30s. Sheikh Said rebellion, 1925, massive anti-Kurdish repression, which lasted for years. The so-called Ar-Rudar Mount Ararat rebellion of 1930, subsequent state violence against Kurds. Anti-Jewish pogroms of Thrace, 1934, and ethnic cleansing following it. Catastrophic Dersim massacre, 1937-38. Use of poisonous gas, adoption of female orphans, and so on. Anti-Greek pogroms of Istanbul, 55. Violence against Alevi, 70s. Violence against the Kurd, 80s, 90s. 2000s, and so on. It keeps going on. Massive repression after the pronunciamento against Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And I leave aside minor things like the Varlık Vergisi of the Second World War, the special tax, and so on. This is quite continuous, I would say, diverse, and unusual. So what is going on? What's going on here? As Ümit Kurt, in a number of articles of his, very interesting, has shown, for example, we see also a continuity in the actors. Provincial notables who participated in the 96-95 massacres, they crop up during the Adana massacres. Those of the Adana massacre crop up during the Armenian genocide, and then during the War of Liberation, resistance against the French and so on, and driving out the returning Armenians. All of those events involve massive participation of the population, and they are combined with demographic engineering and Islamization and/or Turkification of the areas where targeted groups had been living, marked by forced deportations, killings, forcible resettlement elsewhere, and so on and so forth. These characteristics apply to the largest forms of violence, such as those carried out against the Armenians, the Greeks, the Jews of Thrace, and the Kurds. I will attempt a modest, I don't have enough time to go in depth into arguments, but just mention a few things that I see as causes. I mentioned the importance of the failure of the Tanzimat. I didn't mention that by pure chance. The main failure, I think, is the rejection of a civic sense of nationality. The transition between the imperial period and modern Turkey, even in current Turkey, that country has failed to develop an inclusive civic sense of nationality, and this is the root for the violence targeted at so many diverse groups, starting with the Armenians, of course, in the 1890s, and continuing all the way. The second characteristic is a kind of self-definition of identity in terms of domination. Ahmet Cevdet Pasha describes the resistance, the reaction of the population to the Tanzimat decree, saying people are literally crying, "Today we have lost our sacred national rights, which were earned with our ancestors' blood. The Muslim community, while it used to be the ruling religious community, Milleti Hakime, has now been deprived of of such a sacred right. For the people of Islam, this is a day to weep and mourn. So Milleti Hakume, ruling religious community. At this point, the characteristic of ruling was religious. It's not, there is no Turk here, it's not the concept of Turk. But I will save time without going into the details. By 1913 already the Turkishness of it is emerging. That is, the Turks will be ruling, you know, in the last days of the Ottoman Empire. If it can be saved, it will be saved. If not, it will be modern Turkey. Subsequently, the decision is unclear yet at that point, but that's the thing. With Atatürk comes the invention of what Etienne Copeau, in a remarkable article that will be published, called the invention of a bogus Turkishness, a supposedly secular republic with a purely Turkish identity, but in that secular republic with a Turkish identity, at no point was a non-Muslim considered a Turk. And then there were groups of people that were considered not being the real thing, like classic cock. They were like diet cock, you know, Alevi Turks and so on. They weren't the real thing. You see, something was missing. They were Suny of the Hanefi right, and thus they were kind of like deficient and problematic. That has been the problem, and what we have to understand is the failure of a social contract in the late Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, and it started with the rejection of the Tanzimat, and of course the fact that Sultan Abdul Hamid fully endorsed that rejection. Okay, for him this was essential. In that sense also there is continuity. And insofar as the concept of domination is concerned, a keen observer of early Kemalism put it long time ago that Turkey created by Atatürk was Turkey exclusively for the Turks. A prominent Turkish intellectual of the 1920s, Mehmet İzzet, felt, I am quoting, that the role of the Turk was domination, in Turkish hakimiyet rolü, which was to be accomplished by appealing to the, I am quoting, the race of the Turks. Following the Mount Ararat or Ar-Reda Kurdish insurgency in 1930, Minister of Justice Mahmoud Esad Bozkurt made things even clearer. I believe that the Turk must be the only lord, the only master of the country. Those who are not of pure Turkish stock can have only one right in this country, the right to be servants and slaves. Thus we see the transition between Milleti Hakime and this new version of domination, now ethnicized, but the concept of Turkishness, that what Etienne Copeau referred to bogus Turkishness, crumbled down over time, and by the 1970s and early 80s, even the military junta in Turkey was forced to adopt the Turkish Islamic synthesis, recognizing that religion was a key component of the national identity. You know, the third structural cause is massive prejudice that some people would call today racism. I won't go over, I documented that in an article. I have done now much more on that side. Diavurdan dost olmaz, diavurdan defa, zehirden sefa, Ermenide irfan, Yahudide pehlivan bulunmaz. And I keep going on with that, a collection that I have documented with dictionaries of that time, even articles in Turk Urdu, and I have found new ones that I find fascinating. Rum hatunu yatakta, Ermeni hatunu mutfakta yapmak, to do the Greek chick in the bed, and the Armenian one in the kitchen. What I like in this one is that the Armenian woman seems to be spatially more liberated in terms of space. You see, so that's mobility, that's pretty good. Eşeğe Kürt demişler iki hafta Saman Yemevish. So they called the donkey Ker. The poor animal was so depressed he didn't eat hay for 2 weeks. I mean, that's quite understandable. You know, who wouldn't be like that? So the pervasiveness of the prejudice is fantastic. Fourth structural factor of violence, which goes also in the direction of continuity, banalization of state violence, combined with collective participation. You look at the massacres at Adana afterwards, you find a series of participants, remarkable, Kurds and their Arabs, sheikhs, Muslim urban mobs, Softars, religious students, Kurdish porters, Muslim mobs, Kurds, Circassians, Muslims from Crete, Muslim urban population. I mean, it's massive popular participation. I read with great interest Professor Kühne's book on Germans and the Holocaust, which I assigned in a comparative genocide class. I think the degree of participation of the Turkish population compared with what happened in Germany is radically different. Now, insofar as the banalization is concerned, here it's a very important phenomenon in mass violence. I would like to say that banalization is a form of what Bourdieu would call habitus, you know, a kind of predisposition coming from previous practices, institutions, histories, and so on. A particular phenomenon, massacring people, can become normal. It has nothing to do with genetics, with Turkishness, anything like that. That is, it comes from a particular history, resulting from particular institutions, power structures, and so on. And the successful previous experiences of killing people and remaining unpunished are looked at magnificently successful ways of solving issues that can be repeated, okay, improved ideally, and they can go on. These are complemented by denial of official involvement, which actually started with Sultan Abdul Hamid. I have several cases of these denials in front of an American ambassador. He said, "Oh Allah, Allah, what are you saying? I mean, it's impossible that such things might have happened in the eastern provinces." It's about the case of Sassoon, actually. All of this is very important, and now a final point, because I don't want to exceed the time that was allocated to me. The way religion is used or mobilized. It's not religion itself. You see, you can be a Christian and spend your time working for the poor, helping the poor, working free, feeding them, and so on. You can be a Christian and also, I won't say derogatory things, but currently there are, how do you call them, evangelicals, you know, who are extremely happy with some developments. So it has nothing to do with Christianity per se. It's the way you interpret it, you apply it, or the way it can be manipulated in some context. So I don't want to have what I am going to say be misunderstood as being a comment on Islam per se. I believe exactly the same thing about any religion, including Buddhism. To be politically correct, because that's a trend apparently, especially in our area, I want to be politically correct, that religion, yes, had a role. Yeah, it had a role, whether they like it or not, that's how it is. There is no need to expatiate upon the derogatory term concept of Gyavur, but we should also have a look at the concept of jihad. Between 1768 to 92, jihad was proclaimed 6 times officially, but beyond that, as historian Mustafa Aksakal put it, jihad occupied, he says, a quotidian place in the Ottoman cultural register and had a motley everyday presence. In this context, Hans Lukas Kisser, again in an essay that will be published, refers to domestic jihad about the 95-96 massacres, urban mobs organized in mosques together with regional violence of gangs and tribes, he says. Such perpetrators of unofficial domestic jihad were only partly under the control of the central authorities. Official jihad had to be proclaimed by the Sheikh ul-Islam, but it wasn't. Yet they were influenced by an empire-wide parallel structure of religious figures affiliated to the palace regime that Abdul Hamid had established alongside the official administration, and it was those people that excited. Jihad, the Armenian genocide, takes place in the context of an official jihad. The extermination or killing of Greeks after the end of the Second World War, there was a jihad proclaimed by, in 1919 to support Mustafa Kemal's resistance movement. I need 1 more minute. Yeah, exactly. Exactly 1 more minute. Yeah. Issues like the liminal status of the Alevis and so on, all of that has to do with that religion and the way it is interpreted or used in a particular setting by particular authorities. And now that I am almost done and I have mixed my papers, just one more comment. I view the role of Europeans as having been crucial also in the Armenian genocide. Unfortunately, that's the side that is being left out. The British in particular had blood on their hands, so far as I am concerned. Finally, conclusion. What about the present after all of these? Well, the failed development of a sense of civic citizenship almost a century after the founding of the Turkish Republic, and the quasi-continuous history of state-sponsored violence, either fully denied or fully justified in the name of national unity and security, do not bode well for the future. Currently, we witness something that was witnessed during the Hamidian period: the politicization of Islam and the Islamization of politics have been going on. To these two processes must be added a touch of nationalistic, often grandiose rhetoric, as we witness it in the rhetoric of Mr. Erdogan. Okay? Alliance with the nationalist movement party, and a kind of merger, subtle merger between Turkism and Islamism is taking place. What we are noticing today is a transition from the Turkish Islamic synthesis to a Turkish Islamist synthesis, that is emerging slowly. That suggests to me that more violence is likely rather than less violence. And finally, to end on a cheerful note and to recognize the greatness of the Padishah, since we are 100 years later, I think the developments that I have described owe much to the Hamidian period, even though I agree with my colleague, Professor Suny, that the Hamidian massacres, their goal was not to exterminate. That is absolutely beyond a doubt. And like the late Senator John McCain, I also consider Abdul Hamid II to have been indeed a maverick. No, thank you.
Thank you to both of our speakers. And I think before we take questions from the audience, I would actually like to ask each of them if they would like to say anything directly about each other's presentations.
Well, I'm upset that he's funnier than I am. So you're funnier. No, there is I think we were put here thinking there might be a real debate, and yet both of us sort of come out in very similar places, right? That there's both a difference between 1890s and 1915, but that there are powerful continuities, right? That is, and as Stephan in his presentation showed beautifully how those continuities continue to the present. That is, states and nations are made by their experiences and the way they imagine, represent, and reproduce those experiences. And it's very hard to get out of that, right? And so Abdul Hamid, 100 years later, I think this is what Stephan ended with, is extraordinarily foundational in dominant trends that exist up to the present time. And it's not accidental that in many ways, I mean, look at the palace that he built for himself in Ankara, that this guy, Erdogan, thinks he's a new sultan, or that Ottomanism, neo-Ottomanism, is now part of the mix of weird ideologies that make up Erdoganism.
If I to add something, is that in a way it was good that we are both on this panel, because Professor Suny focused specifically on the massacre and genocide, and my approach was started with the Armenian question, which is another argument, but leads to the genocide, of course, leads to the massacres, to the genocide, and it leads to the crucial issue, that is, can we address, can a problem that originally is not political, is agrarian, I mean, there is no demand for nothing, there is no Armenian political party around, okay? Can it be solved, on the basis of internal reforms? Okay? That's what should have been rational. Okay? The Rupture appears 40 years after these agrarian issues. Okay? Unchanged 37. So, one of the dangers, you see, when you deal with supposedly the Armenian question and you start with the narrative very late, okay, you forget the root of the whole thing. Okay? And that, I think, is a massive distortion of how things evolve. I fully share Ron's opinion that even very late, there were extremely few Armenians who considered living outside the Ottoman Empire, including among the Tashnaks. I mean, the decision of the 1914 World Congress of the Tashnak. There was no secession, no nothing. They decided to fight on the Ottoman side if they were Ottomans. The other side will fight with Russia because they knew it would be suicidal to do something else, like to rebel in Russia or vice versa. Okay. So the unfortunate development is that you end up with the extermination of a nation, and it builds up thereafter. That's why I did something very unusual in history, to show the pervasiveness of the violence. It doesn't stop, okay. It keeps going. And then you start asking, well, what's the problem with this? Most Alevis are Turks, okay. What's the problem with them? Why are they excluded? Well, they are not just the real thing, you see. Then you reach the Kurdish problem, all kinds of problems, groups, because of the formulation of a type of national identity. Now, this is after 1913, consolidated under Kemal, but it also appears with the Young Turks. Okay? At first, the Young Turks want to preserve the empire. I fully agree with your view. That changes around 1917, when they lose ground in Egypt and in Iraq. Then the idea of preserving the empire was, pure fantasy. Then it was the goal of a kind of nation state, whatever you could keep, and make it Turkish. Oh yeah, by the end of the First World War, I mean, that had ended. And then the war of liberation and so on. So in a way, I think our two presentations complement with one another and maybe raise some issues that might be of interest to you. I don't know.
It's almost like this was planned.
Yeah.
And I see with pleasure, actually, that the title of the session, and I can't remember if we did this on purpose, Tana, or not, was Continuity, not Continuity or Rupture, or Continuity versus Rupture, but Continuity and Rupture. So that accounts for all possibilities. So now the floor is open. Please make your questions short, otherwise I'll hold up the zero.
Thank you. Professor Astourian, if I want to make sure I understood something correctly before I ask my question, that the real Armenian question, if I understood you, was the need for land to feed the refugees from the Russian end. Is that, did I get that right? In Iraq from
not quite.
1850? No.
I might have perhaps misspoken. No, the real agrarian question was the fact that Kurds and then refugees, muhajirs, Muslim refugees, coming in downtrodden conditions from the North Caucasus.
Yeah.
And there were several waves of them. There were the second wave after the 1877 war with Russia, and then it kept going on.
Okay.
And these people were taking over Armenian lands, and there was also sporadic violence. So that's what I was referring to.
Okay, so if I understood the main point that I want to ask about, did you say that it could have been solved by the central government in some way?
Up to 1876-77.
And how could
my
it have...
impression, no, I'm going to reply. My impression is I don't see any evidence that the central government has an anti-Armenian policy in place. And since we don't have research, at least of which I am aware, maybe Mehmet Kolatel's thesis has addressed that now, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay? We don't know why they didn't try to solve this problem. Maybe it's for a very simple reason, that the central government was weak in those peripheries. Maybe it was just that inability to do it because they were already faced with the reaction of provincial notables, Kurdish leaders against the Tanzimat, okay? Against the idea of equality and so on. And maybe they just didn't have the resources to address this issue because that would have antagonized those provinces. But since I don't have the archival research, I suspend my judgment and I just say I don't know what the real reasons are. But I have nothing to say that there was an anti-Armenian policy during those years, late 50s, 60s, early 70s, and it was done on purpose. I cannot say that. I just don't know why. But after Sultan Abdul Hamid, then it's absolutely clear. I have even memoranda of his saying that the Kurds have always been the lords in those areas and the Armenian servants. What are they complaining about?
Thank
you. I just want to make a short comment about Professor Astourian's, what he said about Millati Hakima from the perspective of Ahmad Jawdat Pasha. I think by Millati Hakima he meant Turks. I just want to familiarize this short in quotation. There was a discussion between him and an Arab journalist. They say, this is in the Tarjuman al-Taraki, the Arab language is sacred. Why is that? Because we are told the whole Quran is in Arabic. This is impossible because since the day they set foot on earth to the day on which the Quran was revealed, and now 1300 years after that day, to that day, the Arabs have yet to be able to imitate, produce a single word as like on this Quran. Quran is not Arabic, it's Allahja, the language of God, not Arabic. So, and he has a lot of things to say about Arabs. And actually talks about the zeal for Ottoman language. Thank you.
This is a question for Ron. Early in your paper in discussing the Hamidian massacres, you made a distinction with regard to the genocide, with regard to the lack of central planning. And then, of course, you rightly attacked the provocation thesis, or the spontaneity provocation thesis. But there was certainly planning going on during the Hamidian massacre, or certainly the impression I have in reading mostly from memoirs is patterns that communities were aware that a process was going to visit them, and even the local authorities would act in ways that would signal this oncoming massacre. Do you have anything more to distinguish between this central planning and maybe what we call some local planning or local process or Vilayet-wide process? Because it seems like, and I'm not familiar with the archival evidence, I'm just going on mostly memoirs that are written in that period.
That is a very good question, and maybe that will become clearer during the conference, right? Because in the dissertations and the articles that I've read, etc., there's a kind of vagueness about that particular process, right? How much is the Sultan responsible? How much of the orders go out? But what I've read in some of these documents, and in Toygun's dissertation and elsewhere, is there actually documents in which the Sultan sends things and gives permission in a way, right? So there may be a difference between planning and in the way that you have the telegrams from Talat, right, and special expeditions going out, and the kind of creation of a permissive environment which encourages certain things. There's a concept in the literature around Nazism that Hitler did not have to give orders, that people worked toward the Führer. That was the argument that people have made. That is, they understood or they anticipated what he would want them to do. And then you have documents by Zeki Pasha and others who show that not only do they carry out what they think the Sultan wants or were told to do, but also fabricate precisely at that time, in real time, the version that will later become the dominant denialist version. Right? So it's a complicated situation, but it's much more kind of diverse. I won't say disorganized, but varied in the way these things take place than I had thought before I read all this literature.
Just a short comment on that one. I mean, going in the same direction as Professor Suny. You know, in that excerpt from Hans Lucas Kisser that I read, the Sultan had a parallel network throughout the empire, including preachers, spies, and so on. There wasn't automatically a need to proclaim, you know, from the center, go massacre them. I mean, things could spread. That's how he refers to internal jihad, you know, Kisser.
Yes, I have a question about demographic engineering that's going on today in Turkey, and particularly in the southeast, with the bombing of Sur in Diyarbakir. And I just wanted to ask Professor Astourian your thoughts about the movement of Sunni Muslims from Syria into that area. Is that happening? I've heard that it is beginning to happen. And what you think that might lead to going forward, particularly in this Kurdish-dominated region?
I am not a full specialist of that contemporary issue, even though I follow the news, of course, as you do. This is standard practice historically. I mean, to move people and to bring other populations. That wouldn't surprise me at all. There has been demographic engineering regarding the Kurds for decades. Hundreds of thousands of them have been moved. When they stay in Turkey, at least, have been moved westward, to cities and so on. And historically, there has been that practice, you move them out, you bring more reliable or assimilable population, or you dilute their population and so on. That's how it has been. By the way, the 95-96 massacres, there is an Austrian military attaché, Baron Gissel, he wrote a book about his 20 years in the Ottoman Empire. It's in German. And this guy intercepted a telegram by a provincial governor sent to Abdul Hamid. And I had the text, because of time, I didn't read it. You know, I followed your advice to sum up things. But basically, he says, Your Majesty, I am glad to report that in accordance with your enlightened wish, something like that, all areas in these provinces, you know, have a Muslim majority. So the massacres of 95-96, all, you know, were punitive, were a case of revenge against European meddling, but they also aimed at making it impossible for any kind of reform to be enacted because there wouldn't be any kind of Armenian majority even in relatively small areas. You see? So I cannot give you a definitive answer about the present, you know, the issue you are raising, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. Maybe Professor Akcan can. Yeah.
No, not on that topic. I have questions. But there was somebody else there in the back.
You can go ahead. I'll ask Captain.
No, please, go ahead.
Sorry, just on that note, about correspondence between the palace and the governor. I came across something from the governor of Sivas from before the Hamidiyya massacres, where the palace is asking the new governor how many Armenians live in certain areas in Sivas. And he responds with a certain number after having looked at the records. And the response of the palace is that those numbers can't be correct. You should recheck your records, because if those numbers are correct, then there are over 2 million Armenians in the whole of the empire. So, of course, there's the element of the physical act of the violence enacted upon Armenians to reduce their numbers, but there's also the issue of the diplomatic arrangement and what the Ottoman Empire is trying to do within that network. And that brings me to my second point, which is I think I absolutely agree that the land question is of central significance in the Armenian question, but we can't. Is it really possible to divorce the international dimension of the Ottoman state's relationship with non-Muslims if we think about the fact that the foundational document of Tanzimat equality, I mean, not the Tanzimat rescript itself, but the Islahat rescript of 1856, it's enshrined in an international treaty. And from its very day of enactment, the international powers are very much involved in negotiations over how this equality is going to be realized. In other words, whether it's the violence in Lebanon or in Damascus or in Crete, at every stage of the Ottoman state trying to define its new regime of equality, we have international powers, not in the sense of interfering or, but they're very much a part of that process. So to say that the Armenian question, like their involvement in the Armenian question starts in 1876 or 1878, I think might not really be very descriptive of what's really going on, at least in the minds of Ottoman policymakers.
Well, it is. Have you found documents in the mid-50s suggesting that these people, the Europeans, when they discuss possible reforms such as equality and this and that, are clearly referring to Armenians in those documents? Or is it your conjecture that somehow in the mid-50s already these people were dealing with the Armenian question? In the mid-50s, the Armenian question hadn't even emerged. The first complaints, Armenian complaints, are sent to the Sublime Porte. It was, I have the dates in another text, but there were two series. I think it was 1871 and then 73, if I am not wrong. A series of documents, 350 reports, I don't know how many reports. So if you have evidence suggesting in the mid-50s or 56 that these people have in mind, behind their mind, Armenians, I am willing to fully endorse what you are saying. If you have no reference to that and you assume that you are reading the Ottoman officials' mind, that Osman Lelek is something being done for the Armenians, then I cannot agree with what you are saying. But we'll have a private conversation afterwards, around a drink or something.
Yeah, let's do that.
I understood his question in a different way, though. That is that the attitudes that ultimately develop about Armenians that would lead to massacres or genocide are a combination of a number of things. The land question that he started with is very central. But when it's married to or mixed up with the reform question more generally and international interference, this becomes particularly toxic. I'm reading into your words, but I thought that was what you were getting at.
And the reason I suggested that was because one of the greatest criticisms of even the young Ottomans about the Tanzimat Pashas is that they're being subservient to European interests in their responses to, again, like the massacres in Lebanon, the Crete issue, and they don't necessarily have the land at their center in some ways. Like the massacres of Damascus don't seem to have much with the land question, at least in the 1860 case. But anyway,
May I read something that may be of interest to you, but I didn't have time to do it, but it's funny. It's a kind of poem by Zia Pasha.
Mm-hmm.
He says, it's a convoluted Ottoman, if but God's plan assists in his project, he's laughing, poking fun at Grand Vizier Ali Pasha during the crisis of Crete, 1868. If but God's plan assists in his project, the gypsy's place will soon be in the Grand Vizier's seat. Only for the Jews has he made an exception, since from Greeks and Armenians he has already nominated marshals and ballads, the highest level in the administration. To perfection has he clearly brought the system of equality of rights. Of course, there was resentment about the ideas of the Tanzimat, which applied to all those groups, and there was something else that I couldn't mention, which is extremely important. It is differential modernization, differential rates of modernization among urban Armenians and Turks. Armenians were getting ahead in many fields for various reasons, in particular education, missionary influence, sending kids abroad, and so on, and that was deeply resented. So I couldn't go over all the causes and so on. It's half an hour, and I don't know how long my text is. But the resentment, yes, starts earlier. And you might remember I said that the British and the Europeans, the British mainly, have blood on their hands in this matter. Yeah, so I don't disagree with your perspective.
So my question is related to the role of state. I mean, you both raised the issue that the role of state actually in both cases was a little bit different. In Abdul Hamid's case, the role of state during the massacre is different than during the genocide. What do you think, whether or not there was a distinction on the forced conversion policies between both periods? Both conversion, forced Islamization was an issue during Abdul Hamid's massacre and during genocide. Also, from looking outside, you might think that this is the similarities between both cases. But I think there is a clear distinction between the policies in these both periods. This is my first question. Second is, you never talked about the reform attempt of the period. Isn't there any connection between massacres during Abdul Hamid period and the reform pressure of the great power, 1895 May reform proposal, which then massacres were kind of a reaction maybe to that. And exactly the same thing happened during Armenian genocide. Can we read Armenian genocide as a response of Ottoman authorities towards the reform of 1914? This is my question as the comparison.
Leading question.
Yeah, so the topic of conversion is really interesting, and I agree with you that they're different in the different periods. If one thinks about the Abdul Hamid period as what I would call restorations, that is to create some kind of order in the place, because things are changing, to stop these kinds of changes, and reduce the power of some and increase the power of others, right? Conversion is more permitted there. With the Young Turks, this is what I remember from things I've read. The Young Turks allow people who are convert to Islam for a while to be saved, and then they stop that policy. And then it's like the genocide of the Armenians is not a racial genocide in the way that the Nazi genocide is. In the Nazi case, you couldn't convert from being a Jew because it was in your blood. But you would think it would be possible, and was possible at different times, to convert to Islam from being a Christian. But at a certain point, that seems to be impossible. It's then, everyone's going, Armenian Catholics, converts, whomever. So I think there are nuances, and that would be, again, a lot of these topics, these are very good questions that need the kind of fundamental and local research that I think is coming out of the people who are here.
There is an article about kidnapping, forced conversion of young women in that volume that will appear with Raymond Kevorkian by the spouse of Rupture. No? So the issue, the gendered approach to the Armenian genocide based on archival research or solid research on primary sources is underdeveloped. No, it's still underdeveloped, so far as I know, except if I have missed something crucial. It's one thing to say a few things on the basis of secondary sources, it's another thing to really go and look at the detail. So what I am going to say is extremely preliminary and might be wrong. It's an impression, it's not a certainty. My sense is that during the Hamidian period, there is something similar to what happened in a way in Yugoslavia or what happened in Rwanda. Taking women and so on aims at destroying the community, at destroying its honor, because there is tribal culture in those areas, both among Kurds and among Armenians. When we talk about the Sasunci, what is the Sasunci? Armenian political mythology has portrayed them as glorious revolutionaries. Supposedly, they sit, they read Karl Marx at night, they have debates about Engels, what about Plekhanov, what did he say? The Sasunci is a primitive guy, most of the time illiterate. My best friend was Sasunci, and I cherish his memory. But I don't like mythology replacing history. The Zaytunci, was the most remote, backward part away from Cilicia. About 11 hours from Marash, cut from everything. So what I am saying is that there is a part of the history that is covered up, is that a vast segment of the Armenian population had a culture that was very similar to their surroundings. With a sense of honor, extended families, and so on. I think during the Hamidian massacre, my impression is the violence and also the forced conversion, kidnapping of young women, and so on, had aimed at being destructive of, of the Armenian self. But I haven't seen enough research about it. I think during the Young Turk period, it's different. I don't get the impression that they were against forcibly converting young kids and young women. You know, but it's an impression, so it may be totally wrong, and we have a scholar who raised his hand, he might know more about that.
I wrote a few articles on the 1895 massacres.
Louder so that we can
I
hear.
wrote a few articles on the 1895 massacres, and I have a strong idea that Sultan Abdul Hamid was very much against conversion. And there are many cases, indeed, of conversion, of mass conversions of Armenians in villages that were not accepted by the Ottomans at all. And the problem here was that the local Muslim population resisted strongly against reconversion. So it lasted a few years before these Armenians could reconvert again. And sometimes, dramatically, they had to move to cities to reconvert. But the government was nearly always behind them. And there is also a research article of I think it was, I forgot his name, but I'm suffering from a jet lag and my memory is not very well, but there is a research article on the subject. And there is plentiful evidence that reconversion or conversion was not allowed by the government. There is an exception, however, that is for women and young girls who were abducted during the massacres. There, in those cases, the government nearly never recovered these persons. So hundreds, maybe thousands of women were lost somewhere and became, in families, Muslims. But conversion of villages and whole groups that we find everywhere in documents of 1895, in the years thereafter, they nearly all reconverted. That's my impression.
So, Connor, your question about reforms will have to wait until tomorrow because our time has run out. Before we wrap up, let me just mention that, of course, everyone is encouraged to be back here tomorrow morning. Things will get underway at 8:30 a.m. Oh, it says, excuse me, at 8:45 a.m. And then 9 o'clock proper for the start. So please, let's thank our speakers.